Welcome to today's panel discussion on technology, faith formation, and worship at home that is premiering during the 2020 Calvin Symposium on Worship. My name is Becky Snippe, and I serve as a program manager at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. It is a joy today to talk to these three colleagues in ministry, Rodrigo Cano, Karen Boer, and Kate Williams. These three panelists each wear different hats: educators, church or parish leaders, publishers, pastors, and parents, to name a few. As we begin today, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and their roles that they play in their church or denomination. Kate, would you be willing to start us off?
Thank you, Becky. My name is Kate Williams. I'm the Vice President of Sacred Music at GIA Publications. And I am also a Catholic music minister in the Archdiocese of Chicago.
Karen.
Yeah, hi, I'm Karen Boer. So I work as a creative resource developer for Faith Formation Ministries. That's a ministry through the Christian Reformed Church in North America. And I have the wonderful job of getting to research and learn from churches about the great things they're doing and curate those resources, and when necessary, create resources to help them in their faith formation work. And at my church, I'm a volunteer with children and intergenerational ministry.
Thank you. And Rodrigo.
Hi, my name is Rodrigo, and I'm part of the pastoral team of a church called Community Christian Church that is in the Chicagoland area. We call ourselves a multi-expression church, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So I lead one of the physical campuses, and I also lead our effort to start micro churches, something that we are calling 3C communities. And yep, that's what I do.
Thank you, everyone. Before we get too far into our discussion today, it would be helpful to define what technology is. Technology has been around for a long time. In our context, we might think of technology as microphones or projection software, cassette tapes, vinyls, CDs, or VHS tapes. Worship and faith formation have been influenced by technology for a long time. So, Kate, Karen, and Rodrigo, when you think of technology and worship and faith formation, what comes to mind? Kate, would you be willing to start us off again?
Sure. Technology and worship, especially in this last couple of years, has meant all kinds of things that we never thought it would. I think probably most notably is it has communicated to us once again, in a way I think renewed for us, this desire to be connected to one another and to God in our expression of worship, whether we define that as ritual or faith sharing or faith formation. We've found these new ways, and thank God we have the ability to do so, new ways to be connected with one another and new ways to be connected with people all around the world.
Thank you, Kate. Rodrigo?
Yeah, I mean, for us, part of a little bit of a story, what happened is that we were forced to close our doors like most churches, right? And so we started to think about what technology looks like for us and what does that mean. And so for us, it meant a lot of rethinking about internet and connections and cameras and angles and equipment, microphones, software, all of those things that we were not really thinking about. I mean, we were thinking a little bit about that, but not in the depth that we have to start thinking about it. And not only that part, but also how we connect that to people. So that was like the hardest part, but thinking about all of these things that we were never taught in seminary, right? Like softwares and all of those different things that we have to start thinking about as we went into lockdown for COVID.
Yeah, I would agree to that. You know, I think technology has been interesting in that, particularly during the pandemic, it's allowed us to worship outside of kind of the confines or the structures of church walls. And I think through that, ministry leaders and, and people in the pew, people who participate in worship have been led to think more, well, what does it mean to form faith outside of church walls? And on days, besides that hour, perhaps on Sunday morning when they were traditionally thinking faith was being formed. So I think that technology has led us to think outside of the box, literally and figuratively.
Wonderful. Before we go too much farther, I'd love to name some of these different pieces. So we've named a few: Zoom worship, YouTube Premiere. What, for those people listening, we've all experienced different types of technology in worship, and I'm aware of congregations around the world and even in the United States here who don't have bandwidth to do Zoom worship or YouTube worship. And so can we just take a few minutes to name all the different ways and pieces of technology? So I know here in our home, I've found ideas on Pinterest and different blogs. So that's still technology, right? And so just let's open up those doors and think outside the box and just name ideas.
Yeah. Some of that I was not using a lot, but I started to use WhatsApp. And WhatsApp, it's, the United States is not as common, but all around the globe, they use WhatsApp, and so it's an easy way to communicate. Facebook Live, we started to do Facebook rooms, different ways that we connected with one another.
Yeah, I would, the connecting with one another has been really interesting, right? So I think technology, connecting through social media, like never before were we asking each other, finding ministry leaders who in similar situations and being able to say, what are you doing? How might I translate that? So I've been relying heavily on that.
Yeah, I've used a lot of like Facebook Live, and I've been really plugged into a lot of the social media avenues for technology connection. So namely Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, we even just got a TikTok, still figuring that out. And I can see, it's really interesting too, within those platforms themselves, the designers and the creative minds behind the platforms are still trying stuff out too. So, like on Twitter, they tried, what were they called? They were kind of like little mini videos on Twitter, kind of like you would do on Instagram. They tried it out for a while and they got rid of it because it wasn't right for their platform. So we're kind of learning right along with the web developers about how to be best connected on each individual platform.
Wonderful. There are so many ideas out there and so many different things to think and talk about. But now let's define the other part of what this presentation is and speak specifically about faith formation. So when you think about what faith formation is, how would you define it or describe it? And I'm going to ask Karen to start us off here.
Sure. Faith formation is challenging to define. I think people have all sorts of different ideas. My colleague Chris Scone talks about how faith formation is about becoming more like Jesus, and that's both as a person, but also within a community of God's people, and that happens in response to the work of the Holy Spirit. And when I think about describing it, something that I use a lot in my work is a concept developed by Robert Keeley and Laura Keeley called the building blocks of faith, and super helpful. It looks at 4 sort of building blocks, things that we all needs that each person has for their faith to be formed. So one is belonging. And I think almost everything comes down to belonging, knowing you belong to God and to God's family, the church. Knowing and growing in your knowing and understanding of God's story and your place in it, knowing where your hope comes from, and also sensing that you are called and equipped by God, whether you are 3 years old or 103 years old. So that's kind of the framework that I use when I think about faith formation.
Wonderful. Rodrigo?
Yeah, we use something similar to that. We call the 3 connections, the that we want everyone, every Christ follower to be engaged with. And so the one connection is our connection with God. And that talks about celebrating together, but also spiritual disciplines like praying, scripture, all of these things. And then the second connection is connection with people, like doing life together. So we believe the spiritual formation is not just an individual thing between us and God, but it's also something that happens in community, through community. And our third connection is with the world. Like, what is our mission? What is God calling us to do outside of the community of faith? And so, and we try to be careful not to put it as like a goal or as a destination, but rather like as a journey. This is what we expect, or what we would hope that every Christ follower, everyone who comes to our church, is experiencing that connection with God, the connection with other people, and connection with the world. And so that's how we would define spiritual formation in our context.
And I think for us, the two things that come to mind when I think about faith formation, one is a professor of mine at Catholic Theological Union, Richard McCarran, once defined catechesis as preaching or telling the gospel in words that they can hear. So I think it's very much echoing what Karen is sharing too, that if you're preaching the gospel to a 3-year-old, you would tell it in a different way than you would tell your peers, or you would have a conversation with your parents. But that in and of itself is faith formation, using words that we can understand and comprehend, that are relevant to our lives, and that are unique to our circumstance. And the other thing is that I believe it was Pope Francis who said to preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. So that that telling of a story in words that they can hear is also done through our actions and our example, and the way that we live life and interact with the people of God in all of our daily living, at work and in our families and everywhere.
Wonderful. Thank you for those enlightening, descriptive definitions. Now I'm going to ask very specific questions to each of you about your specific areas of ministry. So Karen, can you talk a little bit more about the podcast that you're a part of, Open to Wonder?
Yeah, I would love to talk more about Open to Wonder. So Open to Wonder is a podcast that we launched several months ago through Faith Formation Ministries. And it's a place where we wonder about how our faith is formed in everyday life. And so we do that by inviting guests, which technology provides us with opportunities to engage with guests from all over in all sorts of different contexts, which is amazing. And we ask them 4 kinds of questions: big questions, small questions, weird questions, and hard to talk about in church questions, which are my favorite, right? Because often there's things that we assume or that go unsaid. And so we just put it out there and we ask the questions that we think people are wondering about. So season 1 was really timely. It was called Beyond Sunday. And we explored, what does it mean for faith to be formed 24/7 outside of church walls? And we explored, just the importance of being attentive and intentional about faith, and just kind of, we spent a lot of time learning from 4 fabulous people about that. And, you talked about technology and different uses. So what we've realized is, there's the traditional format of small group study, which we've probably all experienced, where you get a book and you work through 7 chapters or whatever. And sometimes it's awkward because you didn't do your homework and you show up. And so we're also using the podcast as a way for churches to hopefully engage with those conversations. And instead of saying, read this book, it's like, listen to this podcast and then get together and talk about it. So we're really excited about Open to Wonder and the opportunities it gives us to engage with believers all over the world from all different denominations, and those who are just stepping into their faith.
Thank you, Karen. We will be sure and try to link to your
Awesome.
podcast in the description for on the webpage for that. It's a wonderful listen. Thank you for your work on that. Kate, can you speak about what GIA is doing to help provide resources for faith formation?
Yeah, so we were very fortunate that we had begun a lot of this process way before the pandemic was even a twinkle in anyone's eye. um, so we began digitizing our entire catalog. So when people would traditionally be used to ordering an octavo and receiving it in the mail and passing it out to their choir, now that's available as a PDF download, and you can purchase, however many exactly you need for your choir, and just download it and print it at home. So that's made things immediately accessible to music directors who wouldn't otherwise. And at the beginning of the pandemic, when we were all concerned about, like, is it safe to get things in the mail, and do you need to be sanitizing everything that is delivered to your home and your groceries and all of that? So that was really, really helpful to have a bunch of that body of work already made available at the beginning of the pandemic. Once the pandemic was underway for a couple of months, we realized that not only did we really need to find other ways to be connected to our customer base, but we really wanted to. Like, we missed people, we missed interacting with people and meeting people at conferences and hearing from people, about their experience, so that we might best respond as a company to provide resources that are relative and necessary. So we began a webinar series, and very similar, we had lots of voices from all over the country join us for panel discussions like this, just for lectures, and for even for very casual conversational exchange of ideas that became deeply, deeply meaningful to us, because it helped us to kind of expand our bubble and make those conversations that were once only had, within the confines of our publishing house, make those conversations available. So kind of, removing, taking away that veil of mystery about what actually happens in those conversations, and showing people it's a reflection of the conversations that everybody is having within their own homes and their own workplaces. We have a podcast too, and one of the things that right now, we're recording this in the season of Advent. So one of the examples that we like to show is we created an audio Advent calendar, which members of our staff take a few lines of the scripture of the day, reflect on that for a couple of sentences, either how it impacts their life, or challenging listeners to maybe think about it in a certain way, from a certain perspective, and then pair that with a recording of a piece in our catalog. So once again, really drawing those lines more intentionally between the music that we're singing and the possible meanings that it might have on the listeners and the participants of the music. Those are kind of the primary ways that we do kind of the serious work engaging way to be connected with people. And we also do things like for fun too. So internally, we use technology now as a way to have those kind of like coffee hour times, or the end of the week kind of celebratory times, those efforts that we make as a team to try to affirm one another's work, and also the personhood of one another. And then, of course, even before the pandemic, Michael Silhavy and I had a little Facebook Live. We called it a show that we tried to do once a week, that just kind of, again, showed people the types of conversations that we're having, which between Michael and I, is, I think, meaningful to me, certainly, because we're crossing some divides here in those conversations, a generational divide, a cultural divide, in that he's from the Chicagoland area, I'm from very rural America. And so we began kind of that risk taking of putting our differences and our conversations about those differences out in the open, so that people can see how these conversations might go, and hopefully give people permission to have those conversations on their own too.
Thank you, Kate. And we will link to those resources you mentioned as well in the description. Thank you. Rodrigo, would you be willing to talk about the model of the community that your church is supporting and explain it to us?
Yes. So, I mean, we talk about becoming a multi-expression church. That's what we're calling ourselves. Before the pandemic, we would say we were one church with multiple locations, and now we're saying that we're one church with 4 expressions. And so the 4 expressions of church that we have, one is community online, which is our version of church online. And it's not that we just broadcast a service, we produce something that is specifically designed for online viewing. So it's engaging, and it has different ways to get people connected. And we have moderators, and so we have a lot of different things. And then we have what we call the physical location, which is the regular campuses around the Chicagoland area. Then we have something that is our version of churches in prisons. And so we have 3 churches in 3 different prisons around the Chicagoland area. So Joliet, Aurora, and DuPage County prisons. And so we are fortunate enough that we are the only organization that has come back after the pandemic into the prison system. We have really good connections there, and we were allowed to go there, and it's just like an open door that we were not expecting, or we were praying for, and God opened that during the pandemic. And then something that we started to experiment with during the pandemic was this idea of micro churches. Something that we talk about is like people still wanted to be connected with one another and really like engage with one another. So we started with some digital, what we call watch parties. And so we would show the video of church, but we would watch it together. And then after that, we would, drink coffee and start talking about the service and, how's your week going? What are some of your start? We would pray for one another, and we would do that. And then we said, okay, who feels comfortable doing the same thing, but in our backyard? And people started to show up in different backyards and different garages, and we started watching the service together, still keeping social distance, but watching the service together. And then we would have coffee and pan dulce and, like all of these amazing things that we would have together. And then we started to think, okay, how can we train and equip not just a few leaders, but a lot of leaders that can do this on their own, and for them to reach out to their own communities, to their own, where the places where they work, where they live, where they play. What are some of the resources that we can give them so that they can do this on their own? And so we started thinking, and we started talking about what we call now 3C communities, talking about those 3 connections that we talk about. So we say it's a full expression of the church, but in a smaller context, because the leader is helping people connect with God, connect with others, and connect with the world. And so we started thinking about those things, and we developed a training and the whole thing. And so far we have developed 9 micro churches, and then we have 3 more that are in the process. And God is using them in such a powerful ways, because people are getting connected. Like, for example, we didn't have something specifically in Spanish, and so we started 1 in Spanish. We actually started 2 in Spanish, 1 digital and 1 physical. And then like we have a group of millennials that were trying to invite their friends to church for the longest time, and they would not come. But they're coming to their house, and they're having dinner together, and they're engaging into the Word of God, and they're reading, and they're praying, and they're doing a lot of like things. And they would even say, like, we are surprised how people are open to come into our home and explore their faith, which is awesome. It's God is using this, and it's not new. I mean, we see it, right? That's how the church started, right? We see it in Acts 2, and so sometimes I'm like, why are we surprised? Like, this is biblical, right? This is what happened. And so we're hoping to train more people and really empower people to do this. And so thinking about the resources that we give them, something that we're saying is that we want to resourcing without imposing. So we're giving them a lot of resources. a lot, like the teaching, video for community online. What are some of the songs that we would recommend? A whole list of resources. But we're saying, at the end of the day, you know your context better than we do. You know what the people that you are ministering to need. And so it's all of these are in your tool belt. Use whatever tools you need. And we don't think that we're going to be offended if you don't use any of these things, but we want to give you as many resources as we have, so that you can focus, not trying to think about like, oh, what am I going to teach, or what am I going to preach? We want you to focus on the relationship, like focus on on really engaging people and where they are. And we want to give you the tools that we think you might need. And then once again, like, you feel free to use them as you want to. And yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting journey, for a learning curve for us as well as the church. But really good.
Thank you, Rodrigo. What was it? Can you clarify for me, were those 3C communities in process already, or even a dream before the pandemic, or has this all happened since the pandemic started?
It was something that we were thinking about before the pandemic. I was thinking particular about the city where I'm serving. It's Aurora, Illinois. It's the second largest city in Illinois. It's about 42% Hispanic. It's like pretty diverse. And we didn't have anything in Spanish. And even though I'm Spanish speaking, but our services are in English. And so I started to think and started to have conversations with some of the leaders at the church, to like, hey, what would it look like if we, instead of us trying to come out with a whole service and all of the resources that it's needed to do that in terms of volunteers and money and all of these things, why don't we identify a few leaders that we can train them, and they can start like micro expressions of the church around Aurora, and then thinking about Elgin and West Chicago, all of these areas where there's a lot of Hispanic population. And it was more like a dream more than anything. And then we were forced to not meet at our locations we didn't meet in person for 50 weeks. So 50 weeks we were online. And so we were forced to think. And I recently heard somebody say that, this pandemic accelerated the church. Like, we are in 2030, right? Like 2020, 2021 actually accelerated the church to think. I don't know if that's like just a random number that this person used, but it's just to make a point that it made us think about the future of the church, right? The church, and so it kind of like forces us to really think about it and put something into action.
Thank you, Rodrigo. The next question I'll ask each of you is going to be a two-parter. So what practices of faith formation worked really well for you and your family or your congregation? And what did you struggle with? So the good and the bad and the kind of good and tell us what worked well and what you struggled with. Kate, can you start us off?
Sure. The things that went well in terms of helped me feel connected and kind of gave me that feeling of belonging, or challenged me to generate that feeling of belonging within my own household. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and a very social 4-year-old daughter. So removing her from the context of friends was really, really hard. So it was good for me to think about my own domestic church and how we live out church within my household, and how that expression of domestic church might simply be shared, communicated, acknowledged, in knowing that we're all a part of our own domestic churches, and there's domestic church practices that we can share too across technology that kind of bridge that gap for us. So virtual Mass for us was certainly a part of every week. My husband's also a music director, so he was going in person, just him and the clergy, and we would watch online and be able to participate that way, and we still do. And it surprised me that I've never been a daily Mass person. I've just been a Sunday Mass person, but during the pandemic, because it was available and because that intentional connectivity to community became more important to me and to so many. I do in the daily mass all the time. So it's interesting that this extraction of physical presence has actually made me in some ways more connected to the community. It also helped me to try to be creative about what it means to have church life. So I wrote some liturgies for liturgies you can do with your kids at home. And of course, we shared that template for liturgy over technology, but it's something that people could take into their home and do themselves and feel like, again, just that they had permission to do that. They had the language to do it. They had the resources to do it. And certainly the blessing of the church and community to be able to take that into their own hands in their home and do it. So those things became really a lot more important. It also heightened for me, especially being Catholic, a lot of what we talk about in Catholic worship is these kind of tangible experiences of liturgy through the senses. So while we're able to those of us with the ability are able to see and hear worship, it heightened that expression of, the things that you take for granted, the sounds of turning pages of hymnals, and of other children and young people, and kind of the smell of bread and wine and incense, and that feeling of being able to touch the body of Christ, and to touch a hymnal, to touch a pew. It made those things, made a new appreciation for those things. As a Catholic person who's never been historically very devotional, I found myself reaching for rosary beads again, and lighting candles on my own. And so it, in a way, kind of it activated my own agency to be an active member of prayer life and with God. I think the two challenges that are still very present for all of us who are navigating virtual and hybrid worship life are, one is accessibility. Not everyone has access to the internet, and not everyone has the facility to navigate all these different apps and webinars and groups and stuff. So I think particularly of our elderly population, there's a lot of new stuff all at once, and not all of them have someone who can help navigate through all of that. Think about people who are isolated, either because they're hospitalized, or they're imprisoned, or they are displaced for one reason or another. That those people have not been able to participate in this kind of new life in virtual worship. And it's our responsibility to not forget about that, and to find other ways to be connected to people who cannot be connected in this way. And the other concern or challenge I think that we all have is that now, because people are figuring out ways to navigate apps and different worship communities and expressions of faith, we need to remember that there still is a lot of misinformation. There's still a lot of, there are a lot of incorrect or unflattering or really unchristian theological takes that are immediately in front of your face all the time. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, there are a lot of bad takes. And so it's really hard to suddenly become the sole filter of what is good and right, and what jives with my being and my understanding of God and God's people, and what is simply not for me, not of God for me, is not something that God wants for me. And that, I think, that constant need to discern all of that and filter all of that for ourselves has become, I think, burdensome. I think especially I hear it a lot anyway from my generation of millennials. We don't need another reason to be disengaged from church life, and those bad theological takes that express a very, very narrow understanding of what it means to be beloved in God's eyes, is we got to be on guard for that, and we got to help each other out in knowing where God might be calling us to a larger worldview than simply what we're seeing on our screens.
Thank you so much, Kate, for those two sides. Karen, would you be willing to speak to these two questions?
Sure. Yeah, you know, when the pandemic began, so March of 2020, I guess, the leadership of our team, of our church, made a decision as they thought, well, what will worship look like? Because we meet in a community center, so we were instantly kicked out of that building. And so they decided that one of the values that would drive our worship together online would be community, intergenerational community. So that led them to choose Zoom. And it also meant that we had to think really creatively about how to engage all ages throughout the time that we were together. And so I was tasked with working towards engaging particularly children. And it was really interesting because as the months went on, and we've actually only worshiped in person 3 times now, so we have not been together for 18 months. What happened was eventually, like, I realized not only was I in someone's home on screen, but I was like sitting on their kitchen table beside the box of Cheerios as the family was eating, right? Like, I saw everyone in their habitat, which became really interesting because I realized, you know, at church on Sunday, like, you know, certain people and you might like visit certain people, but you don't see everyone in their natural habitat. And so in addition to realizing the church was now on a kitchen table while kids are eating, and while, you know, a single woman is sitting in her cozy place that she always sits, or wherever someone would stick the camera, we realized that it provided an opportunity to help people experience faith practices right there in the home, right? So like prior to the pandemic, I might send home a page that says, I encourage you to wonder with your children, and here's how to do that. But because technology suddenly brought me onto their kitchen table, I would envision myself cross-legged sitting there and would wonder in a way that was modeling faith practices so that people could replicate during the week at home. And that was really exciting. And so yeah, through that, what worked well was we also had to learn, Kate, you mentioned engaging senses. And I love that you said the turning of pages. I hadn't even thought about how much I missed that. But yeah, so we would, because, you know, technology is just me on the screen like this, we would do things like, you know, hold your hand on your heart and breathe in and breathe out, and maybe hold your hands out as a way to, you know, teach how to be still before God during prayer. So we would actually do it. And with, you know, 40 Zoom screens, you would see everyone doing that. And we would do other things like that, or have people bring something to hold up or to share. So we worked hard at engaging all senses. We also started something, and I think many churches will have like a prayer request time where people can share prayer requests, but we also added, after the message, there was an opportunity to unmute your microphone and share something that you had heard or that you felt God was nudging you to say. And children would, because kids were doing online school, they would unmute their microphone and say what they had heard God saying to them. People of all ages would do that. And that too was fascinating. It suddenly, the message became 3-dimensional, because what had been preached, we were now hearing how different people were hearing that and how they were applying it to their lives. And so now that we're meeting in person, we are still doing that. And it's fascinating. It just adds a whole other layer to the story. I mean, it's not without risk, but that's okay, right? So that has been really amazing. The struggle, I think that the biggest struggle is that there is no replacement for authentic relationships. This ultimately is empty. If I would burst into tears right now, you all might say, oh, Karen, I'm sorry you're crying. But then I would have to turn off and eventually walk away, and I'm here alone. So there is no hug, right? I might say something funny. You might look like you're laughing, but I don't hear that. So there is no, you can't replicate holding a hand or a hand on a shoulder or any of that 3D stuff. So that's the one struggle. But other than that, we learned some really cool things that I hope will continue during worship moving forward.
Thank you, Karen. Rodrigo?
Yeah, for us, thank you, Karen, for sharing that. I think what you just said, I think was one of the struggles, and I'll start with the struggles because it was really, really hard to live in that tension of trying to be pastoral, but not being around people. And in our process, during the time that we did not meet, we lost people in our congregation, right? And we couldn't cry together. We couldn't be together to hug each other and really like mourn and lament. And then teaching people also like how to lament well in the mid. I mean, lamenting it's for some churches, at least in our context, it's not something that we do very well. And then in the pandemic, it made it like even harder to really like engage people in lamenting. So that was very difficult. And that's still like something that I personally, and as my family and I like really still struggle, because not only we lost like people who passed away, but we lost people who we thought they were, there with us in church, and all of a sudden they say like, well, we don't want to go anymore, or we found another church, or and I mean, it's good that they found another church, but still like it hurts, right? This idea of walking alongside people for a long time, and then all of a sudden something happens. And I mean, we can get into all of these vaccine, no vaccine, mask, no mask, like all of these things that shouldn't be as important, or I mean, they're important. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, but the thing is that it has created so much division, and we lost people because of that. And it's just been hard, and really personally as a pastor, and with my family, walking with my family through that, starting with my family, and then inviting the rest of the church to walk with that has been very difficult. Yeah, it has been a struggle. On the other side, like we have so much information available, we have so much things at the tip of our fingers, right? Like a devotional, or a prayer, songs, all of these things that are available, so that I can do church basically anytime if I feel the need to do something, or that I need, I feel the need to pray or take a pause, whatever, like I can do it at any time. So that's been really well. And for me also, what's been really good, like a good experience, is seeing my daughter. She's 14 years old. And so she started in the pandemic. She was 13, 14 years old, really being engaged and watching the services. And now that we transition like from online into in-person, like her engagement has actually increased. Like it's amazing for me to see that in a 14-year-old, that she might be distracted with so many other things, but she's being engaged. And we've seen it with other students, with other young people that are still getting engaged and wanting to be with one another, and we're started to get more engaged when things were happening only online, but now they're getting more engaged when they're in person. And that's been really, really, really good for us to experience, individually as a parent, but also as a church.
Thank you, Rodrigo. From all of your experiences, what recommendations would you have for those who are listening to this discussion for rich experiences of faith formation? Karen, can you start us off?
Sure. In general, I would say look for every opportunity you have to make those intergenerational. My faith is formed sitting with your 4-year-old, and their faith is formed sitting with me or the teenager who's nearby. quick story. Years ago, I went into the kitchen before worship. It was a communion Sunday, and I came across two women who were elders in our church, and they were getting the elements ready for communion. And they had found two little girls who were sitting out in the hallway while their dad was practicing with the band before worship. And they could have just said hi and walked into the kitchen, but instead they said, "Girls, would you like to help us? We're getting the Lord's Supper ready." And when I walked into the kitchen, there was an 8-year-old standing on a chair, like carefully squeezing juice into each of the communion cups, and her sister setting crackers on the plate. And, half an hour later, when I participated in the Lord's Supper with them, watching them, knowing that they had, getting back to belonging, participated in that preparation as full members of the church, that was faith formative for all of us. So that's always my biggest thing for rich faith formation practice. And it doesn't always work, but that's significant. But also, engaging senses and paying attention to modeling faith practices. One of the things I think we learned during the pandemic is that we thought all this work we'd been doing for years with all these programs and bringing people in and all these small group studies and teaching them how to form faith. And then the pandemic hit. And as ministry leaders and people, we all kind of panicked and thought, how are we going to nurture faith now? Which is kind of weird, right? Because when you think, well, wasn't that what we were preparing for all these years? So I think people struggled with their reliance on church on Sunday and other church provided activities to understand, how do I live into my faith at home? How do I be intentional about living out of my faith in the community? So I think as much as possible during worship, model faith practices by experiencing them, whether it's being still before God or wondering or using Lectio to engage in scripture during worship, and they leave with a piece of paper that has words circled or phrases underlined, those things as much as possible. And then I think, a challenge moving forward is paying attention to, if you're using a hybrid model, if you've got some people gathered there and some people watching from at home, it's critical that the people watching from at home feel that they are equal participants as though they were there, not that they're viewers. That's a challenge. I think that's going to be a big challenge moving forward as we plan worship, but I think we'll figure it out.
Yeah, God willing, we'll figure it out, right, Karen? Rodrigo.
I think like what Karen was saying, like creating engagement opportunities for people to really get engaged, because behind the screen, and even sitting in our pews, sometimes you can be just like as spectators, right? Like, I'm just here and whatever they tell me to do, or even I'll participate in whatever capacity I want, but to really engage into what's happening and the things that are being displayed and the things that they're inviting us to participate. So I think we as leaders, we need to be aware of that and what opportunities of engagement we are providing to our people. Because we talk about the priesthood of all believers in our context, we talk about it all the time, but sometimes we leave it to the experts, in a sense, right? 2 or 3 people that are telling us how to do it, what to do. But if we create enough opportunities for people to really engage and lead, and so like me as a parent, I'm helping my family discover, what it means to do faith together. And if we empower like parents to do that, and we teach, other people to do that, I think that creates, it's spiritual formation not only relies on a few people, but now everyone is doing their part and everyone is playing a key part in forming people to do faith. I've had the opportunity, now that we're doing something in Spanish as well, to reach out to my family, that some of them live in Mexico or in Arizona or different parts that are not close to where I am. And just once again, like creating these opportunities of engagement, and either it's a chat, or we have WhatsApp, or we're talking about like all of these things, and they're getting engaged, and that's helping them grow in their faith. And something that they never used to do before, or thinking that a church is just somewhere we go on Sunday for an hour or an hour and a half, whatever that is. And now it's not like church is this community of faith that we get to engage with one another throughout the week. And if you have a crisis, or you have something that is going on in your life, you don't have to wait until Sunday. You can send me a text, you can whatever it needs to happen, so that we can engage with one another. So I think creating those opportunities of engagement, channels of engagement with people, it's key at this time.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And Kate.
I would just echo so much of what Karen and Rodrigo have already said. I think in particular, that openness to different types of engagement and faith formation in ways that we previously hadn't considered a part of our faith journey, and how much richness lives there, and how much we have both an opportunity to receive some great gifts from those new ways of being connected, but also offer some gifts that maybe we hadn't considered being worthy of offering before, and now we do. And just second that just affirmation that we're engaging faith formation with our minds and our hearts, and not to neglect our bodies. Our bodies are a part of our faith formation and our experience of worship, and our expression of worship. So that engagement of all of the senses, and that in whatever form you might be used to, or maybe trying some new forms, that engagement of your whole body to sit and stand and kneel and pray and practice postures and smells, and just, if you don't have the ability to hear those pages of a hymnal turning, to just remember that, and to remember or to renew a desire for that. And of course, in my realm, what I care very deeply about is sung prayer. So remember not just to listen to the song or to look at the song, but to sing the song, to put it in your body and make those words of God and those ancient melodies and those new melodies vibrate within your whole being, and let that kind of stimulate and renew your love of God and God's people.
Such rich ideas from all of you. Thank you. What do you see as the role for technology going forward? So the other piece of our conversation here, and Kate, I'm going to ask you to start us off here.
Sure. In a way, like my colleague Matt says, never waste a crisis. So we have learned a lot from this crisis, and it would be a shame to simply go back to the way that things were, because we learned a lot about ourselves. We challenged ourselves. We have all kinds of really successful creative stories about how to adapt and become anew again. So I think technology is going to be a part of our worship from here on out, and all of the iterations that exist now and all the iterations that are to come yet. Technology is yet another conversation partner with us about how to be connected and how to express the richness of diversity in as well as our unity in kind of mission as people of God. Technology is going to be around, so do whatever we can to remain engaged with the conversations about how to use technology now, and how we might further evolve our technology to serve us even better, and remain engaged with the people for whom accessibility to that technology, for whatever reason, might be a challenge, to not abandon anyone along the way because of means or access or preference. So it's here. It's here, and we learned a lot, kind of like a baptism by fire. So let's take that with us into our future.
Thank you, Kate. Karen.
Yeah, I would just add, I think moving forward, I think it'll be important to remember that technology is a tool, and it's one tool in our toolbox. And so to, as we plan faith formation, to rather than letting technology take the lead, which is kind of what we were forced to do initially, but to think first about the needs of people, the way in which faith is formed, and then hold up technology as well. How might we use that in the way that we might use any other thing that we use to engage people? So rather than saying, well, here's the technology, how can we fit people into that? Look for what people need, and then look for the technology forms that will make sense for your context and for the people you're serving.
Thank you. Rodrigo?
Yeah, I really echo what Kate and Karen are saying here. What I would say on the other end is also like, I know there's some churches that don't have the resources, a lot of resources in terms of access to technology. So what I would say to the churches is like, use what you have, because people what are really looking for is authenticity. So even if it's an iPhone recording, or like, it doesn't have to be like HD and like all of these, it just needs to be authentic, and then it really reflects who you are and what you're trying to communicate. And people I think, are longing for that. That's why we have like so many like TikTok and stuff like that, right? Because it's like spontaneous, authentic kind of like, channels that we have. And so, because what I've discovered in terms of technology is that some small churches want to produce as the big churches, and they get frustrated in the way, because obviously like they will not be able to do what big churches can because of money and resources and all those things, right? So with whatever technology you have, make the best use of what you have. And I also know, what I'll say this also is like, I know there's a lot of resources out there. I'm pretty sure the Worship Institute has a lot of resources. So like, look for those resources, because not all of the things you have to, you don't have to create all of the things. Like, there's already some resources out there that you can reach out to people that are able and willing to help. And so that it makes it easy for people to use technology. You have to figure it all out on your own. There's already some people that are taking some steps. So I would say that in terms of technology.
Thank you, Rodrigo, and thanks to all three of you for this wonderful discussion. Before we conclude, is there anything that any of you would love to add, or any questions that any of you have?
I would just add, I'd like to say we're coming out of the pandemic. It's hard to know where we are in the pandemic, but just for people to remember that I think we've all been doing the best that we could under the circumstances. And I think, at this point, I know in my world, I'm hearing, a lot of, well, the church forgot kids, or our church didn't do this. And so I guess I would say, as ministry leaders, and those who work with ministry leaders, or those who are part of a church, to extend grace to those in leadership who, like everyone else, have been tired and exhausted and worn out by the pandemic, and have experimented their way into new ways of being that, yes, some didn't work so well, but some have, and some will stick with us. So I just think that that's so important to remember as we continue to experiment our way into new ways of forming faith. And like you said, Rodrigo, building on old ways, things that were in the Acts church. And just this reminder, a conversation like this is so encouraging. And for people who are listening, knowing we're this global church, seeing where God has been working in each of our contexts is so exciting to me. So thankful. I'm thankful for this opportunity to hear what God's been doing in all the places you all are.
Yeah, me too. I can echo that for sure. It's a gift to be able to be connected to both of you, who I wouldn't have otherwise known or had the opportunity to chat with. And of course, very grateful to all the institutions like the Calvin Institute for Worship that has made available all of these conversations, and really done that, work in the trenches of trying to figure out how to use these technology mediums to serve us while we need it. especially, but also how it might inform our future together. So I'm grateful for this conversation and to meet you all.
Yeah, I mean, I will echo what Kate and Karen are saying here. Let's be gracious with with ourselves. Like sometimes I think we put a lot of pressures on our own, because we're trying to do the best that we can, right? And we know it's been a difficult season. But I would say, let's be gracious with ourselves. Let's be gracious with if we're in a position where we have staff or we're overseeing other people, like let's be gracious with that people, and also let's be gracious with our parishioners as well. Like everyone is trying to figure things out, and so sometimes it's frustrating because we're trying to engage people and saying, hey, but we have this opportunity, and people are saying, no, maybe not right now, and it's easy to get frustrated, and hope that things will go faster. I mean, but let's just be gracious, and like Karen was saying, like we're trying it, and we'll see what works. We see what don't work, and we'll go from there. We'll have to see. So let's be gracious with one another.
Amen. Thank you to each of you, to Kate, Karen, and Rodrigo for joining me for this conversation today. And thank you to everyone who's joining us in the premiere for this conversation during the Worship Symposium 2022. We are so grateful for each of you and the many ways that you work every day in the trenches of ministry. Many blessings to each of you.